Scott Clark, Dr. Clark, and he's going to help us think through some law and gospel. I'm going to put him in the hot seat here, and then, but we just want to really thank you for joining us and taking your time to be with us today. Why don't you take a little bit of time, Dr. Clark, and just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your ministry and anything else you'd like to share with us as we begin.
Okay, I am a pastor in the United Reformed Churches. I am a what is my title? Associate minister in the Escondido United Reformed Church. I was ordained to pastoral ministry in 1988. Started as an assistant pastor in Kansas City in 1987. Served in Kansas City for 6 years at what is now Northland Reformed Church. So if you're up by the airport in Kansas City, that's where they are now, I think on Cookingham Road. And when I was there, we were down by North Kansas City. I went to a seminary where I teach now, Westminster Seminary, California. Married, 2 kids, grown kids, no grandkids. I teach at Westminster Seminary, California, where I have been teaching since 1997. Before that, I taught at Wheaton College for a couple of years. I've taught a few other places over the years, as a visiting prof and the like. I teach church history, historical theology. I've taught systematics, though I haven't taught it for a number of years. I used to teach the doctrine of God. I've taught prolegomena. I taught a survey course one semester years ago. But mostly I teach history. I teach patristics, medieval Reformation, and then some post-Reformation Reformed scholasticism. And my academic interest, my writing interest tend to be around Reformed orthodoxy, Reformed theology, the history of Reformed theology, piety, and practice. That's where I've published a couple of books on that topic. One, Recovering the Reformed Confession, and one on Caspar Olevianus, who's early Reformed covenant theologian from the 16th century, and one of the contributors to the Heidelberg Catechism. I write a blog, heidelblog.net, and I do a couple of podcasts, office hours for work, and my own personal podcast, the Heidelcast. I don't know. Is that it? Is that enough?
Yeah, that you did a good job. I in the comments on our Facebook page, I put your bio. I was wondering how you were going to get through all that in just a couple of minutes. we like to be done with this podcast in about a half an hour or so.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, that's more than enough.
That was excellent, though. You are involved in a lot of things, and but
John, our normal co-host, is from Nebraska, so we need to mention that you are from Nebraska.
Go Big Red.
No. Yeah. Oh boy.
There's people don't believe me. It is a real, honest to goodness, old school cowbell. That I don't remember where I got. I think that might be from Barbara's grandpa's farm, but I'm not sure. I can't say for certain, but anyway, it's the real thing. Then I have the digital thing. Here we go. I don't know if that will work. Oh, hold on. Let's see. There we go. Hold on. There we go. That's the digital version. So, all right.
So, are you guys having in-person classes at all at this point?
We did last fall, off and on. We were online, and then we were hybrid.
Okay.
And then right at the end of the semester, we had to go online again, full-time online. So right now we are online. We're hoping to be able to go back to hybrid classes later. Now we're in between terms right now. We have the fall semester, then the January term, and then the spring semester starts later this month, February 9th, maybe. So I've been in the middle of a big writing project, and honestly, I other than answering some email and killing some time on Twitter here and there, mostly I have not been paying attention to the schedule. So, but I hope that we'll be able to go back, because they just opened up the restaurants again, not to eat indoors, but we're not. They canceled the curfew, and we're not totally locked down the way we were. This is my project. This is part of my project right now. This is Ursinus's commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism. It's one of the Latin texts, so this is the one I'm using. So I'm working on a commentary on the Heidelberg and going back and forth with Ursinus. So it turns out our English translation that we have from Willard it's good, but it's also problematic. He has a tendency to add things that Ursinus didn't say. Anyway, so it's been interesting. So yeah, we're hoping to be back in person, at least somewhat, later in the semester.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, we've been on our podcast. We've been going through the 1689 London Baptist Confession. Is kind of what we've been doing, and just kind of having discussions on that. And one of the things that continues to come up, whether we're going through that or we're talking about some other issue, is the law gospel distinction, and we're seeing just how important that is. And so we wanted to talk about that today, and maybe the history of it a little bit, and how we have come to understand things the way that we do. And maybe if you would just take a moment and explain to us a little bit in your words what we mean by the law gospel distinction. And
yeah, sure.
Why it's important. Yeah.
It's a really important distinction, and it's one of the 4 or 5 things that really made the Reformation transformational. So in other words, if you take away sola scriptura, sola gratia, sola fide, and the distinction between law and gospel, for example, the doctrine of imputation, those would be the absolute rock bottom essentials. So you take away any one of those things and you lose the Reformation. In the modern period, we've had a lot of trouble with that, particularly in the Reformed world. For a variety of reasons, we just lost track of that distinction, in part because it came to be seen in the broader evangelical world and in the more narrowly in the Reformed world as a Lutheran distinctive, but not something that the Reformed held or taught. And that people came to think that, and they said that sort of thing and wrote that sort of thing because we had stopped reading our own tradition. And we had bought into a story that was more put together, I guess. I was going to say fabricated, but put together in the 19th century, that said that the Lutheran central doctrine is justification, the Reformed central doctrine or dogma is divine sovereignty, or predestination, election, however you want to put it. And that whole story is complete caca. There's no truth to it at all. It's completely false. B.B. Warfield said so in the late 19th, early 20th century. He said, you can't tell the story that way. That was never true of the Lutherans, and it was never true of the Reformed. But that was the way the story came to be told in the 19th century, and lots of people have bought that story, and that's how they think of themselves. And so this is why you see all of these young, restless, and Reformed people describing, and new Calvinists, so-called new Calvinists, describing themselves as Reformed. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? And they simply mean, I believe in divine sovereignty. And that is, as far as they know, the be-all and end-all, the warp and woof of what it is to be Reformed. And in the whole 16th and 17th centuries, all those people are spinning in their graves. They're all doing, 1800 RPM. Because that just is a complete misrepresentation of what it is to be reformed. There's a whole lot more to being reformed. But one of the things that makes the reformed is the distinction between law and gospel, which we share with our Lutheran brothers and sisters. So where did it come from? This is an ancient distinction in some ways. We've been distinguishing in some way between law and gospel since the very early days of the church. The early church spoke of the old law and the new law. So that was one way of doing it, and they were thinking in historical terms. In other words, they were thinking of the Old Testament and the New Testament as the old law and the new law, and then the church came to use law and gospel as synonyms, so that the law stands for the Old Testament and the gospel stands for the New Testament. They weren't saying that they weren't making the same distinction that we make today, right, that the Reformation made, although Augustine begins to do it. If you look in his treatise on the Spirit and the Letter, where he takes 2 Corinthians 3:6 as his starting point, you can see that he begins to talk about what the law can and can't do, and what the gospel can and can't do. And he talks about the law and the gospel in different ways. So I used to think sometimes, or I have thought sometimes, that Luther was exaggerating a bit, because he says in some place that he's delighted to see that Augustine also, and he's thinking of this treatise, he's referring to this treatise, also distinguished between law and gospel. And I've sometimes thought, well, that's a little hyperbole, but I actually think maybe Luther had a point there. If you read Augustine, and I think you really do have to, on these sorts of things, read Augustine slowly and carefully, because sometimes it's very dense. He actually does begin to distinguish between the law as one kind of thing, wherever it is in Scripture, and the gospel as another kind of thing. And he does begin to talk about the law for sinners as bad news and the gospel as good news. But for most of Christian history, between Augustine and the Reformation, people thought of law and gospel principally in historical terms. So the law is the Old Testament, the gospel is the New Testament. But they tended also to think of, and Thomas is very clear about this, Aquinas is clear, that the Bible is all law. The Old Testament is the old law, the New Testament is the new law. And the difference between the old and the new is that there's more grace under the new. The Holy Spirit has been poured out under the new, and we don't have the types and shadows anymore under the new law, but we're still basically, we relate to God fundamentally on the basis of the law. So the great breakthrough of the Reformation was for Luther to recover the notion that, I think it's very clearly a Pauline notion. I think it's elsewhere. I think it's all throughout Scripture, but it's very clearly Pauline, that relative to sinners, the law says one thing. It says, do this and live. And the gospel says, looking forward from the Old Testament, that Christ shall do, right? The seed of the woman will do battle with the seed of the serpent, and the seed of the woman will crush the serpent. So that is a promise of the gospel looking forward. Whether you're looking at Isaiah 52:53, or Isaiah 7, or Psalm 110, or Psalm 22, or wherever you're looking in the Old Testament, the gospel is a promise of something that's coming. And then in the New Testament, of course, we're looking retrospectively, looking backward and saying, so the gospel is what Christ has done for us. And those are two different kinds of words. And so what the Protestants did, Lutheran and Reformed did, was to begin to use that question, that distinction, as a kind of hermeneutical question. How does this passage before me relate to law and gospel? So, for example, Theodore Beza in the 1550s says that the greatest problem afflicting the church today is the inability of people, or the refusal of people, to distinguish between law and gospel. William Perkins said in his famous book on preaching, The Art of Prophesying, that before you ever preach a passage, you have to determine whether this passage is law or gospel. So this was a basic conceptual distinction that the Protestants came to make, And Luther said that when he discovered or rediscovered the distinction between law and gospel, it was transformative of the way he read the Bible. And that was certainly true in my experience, because I was a preacher for 10 years, and I knew the theory in some ways of the distinction between law and gospel, but I didn't know the practice of it. And I had not been drilled in distinguishing between law and gospel. And oftentimes in my preaching, and I'm not saying that I haven't done it since, but at least if I do it now, I'm doing it against my better judgment and my conscious intent. But for a good 10 years, I would preach the gospel. I remember preaching a series through the Exodus, and the gospel, of course, is all through the Exodus. But then at the end of the sermon, I felt like I had some obligation to apply the passage, which is not unreasonable. You want the application to come out of the text. But I thought I somehow had got the idea that to apply the passage, I almost needed to put them back under the law. And so I was doing that. And I knew there was something pretty profoundly wrong with my preaching, and I'm sure many people would have agreed that there were many things wrong with my preaching, and still are. But there was one thing that was seriously wrong with my preaching, and I couldn't tell what it was, and nobody else seemed to know what it was. And it was only when I heard Mike Horton give a 20-minute talk in the summer of 1998. We had a conference on preaching on the campus. We had Jay Adams here. We had Tim Keller. Today, if we did this conference, it probably would be a big deal. But this was just a bunch of guys meeting literally in the seminary student lounge, and we were a bunch of guys making presentations on preaching. Bob Godfrey. I don't mean to leave anybody else out, but there were several people making 20-minute presentations on preaching. Mike got up and made a presentation on distinguishing the law and gospel in preaching, and that at that moment I realized, yes, this is what has been wrong with my preaching for 10 years, that I haven't been making that distinction as I've been speaking to the people and as I've been looking at the text, analyzing the text. I wasn't using that distinction to help me understand the text. So that's a thumbnail sketch of how we got where we are. There's a chapter in a book called Covenant Justification and Pastoral Ministry, where I discuss this some more. Oh, there it is. Yeah, the title of the chapter is Letter and Spirit. And then there are a lot of resources. There's a whole resource page on the Heidelblog, heidelblog.net/resources. And under there are lots of resources on distinguishing law and gospel. And just in case the listener is thinking, or the viewer is thinking, yeah, well, I understand the Lutherans do that, but the Reformed, we don't do that. I have lots of source materials showing the opposite in both the chapter and online.
So you said it's Luther and Melanchthon helped recover it, and Calvin basically agreed, but also the Baptists came along too. I like to quote Spurgeon on the law gospel thing. So how it's pretty ecumenical. It's really a Protestant distinction.
Yeah, for anybody who is genuinely connected to the Reformation, it's an essential distinction. Now, the Anabaptists did not accept it. So there's a distinction between the Anabaptists and the Baptists on that point. That's an important distinction. The Anabaptists thought it was a terrible distinction that by saying that sort of thing, you were going to lead people to immorality and impiety. And lots of Reformed folk have also, in the modern period, against their tradition, and I think against their confession, have also denied it. The Federal Visionists have denied it. Of course, Rome denies it. And but most of the time, people are just ignorant of it. That's the main challenge that we have, is that people just aren't aware of the fact that there is such a distinction, and what it is, and how it functions, or how it helps.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a lot of confusion today with it yet too. I know there's a 5 views book on law gospel. I haven't read it. Did they just make up some more views to get the 5 different views, or how many?
Well, if you're thinking of the same one I'm thinking of, the actual traditional Reformed view isn't even represented in the book. I'm honestly, I'm not a big fan of those things. Those things are only as good as the selections and the editor. So sometimes I guess they can be helpful, but I remember looking at that book thinking, well, this is not helpful at all. It isn't really all that difficult to see the different views.
So one article I read had it affirmed law gospel in regards to historical nature, which you've already mentioned, and in the systematic form for justification. But then when it came to law gospel as a hermeneutic, it completely denied that aspect as helpful. And because how they understood it was that it denied the third use of the law.
Well, that's completely wrong, and wrong-headed and ignorant, because the people who gave us the law gospel distinction also taught the third use of the law. So let's say I'm not a Lutheran. I'm actually engaging in a fair bit of research on the Lutherans and some critique of the Lutherans in the work that I'm doing right now. But we have to tell the truth, right? That's essential. So it's not hard to find out what the Lutherans say. They publish their views, their official views, in a large volume. This is the modern critical edition. It's called the Book of Concord. And it's got the Luther's catechisms. It's got the Formula of Concord, the epitome of the Formula of Concord, and a whole bunch of documents. Obviously, it's 600 and some pages. And in there, if somebody will take the 5 minutes, take the 5 minutes it takes to discover what the Lutherans say on this, one will see that the Lutherans affirm both the distinction between law and gospel, as we do, and also the third use of the law. In fact, it was Melanchthon who gave us the language, tertius usus legis, third use of the law. So they've always, and Luther teaches it in substance. In fact, it was Luther who gave us the term antinomianism, because he was opposing antinomians in the 1520s and continued to oppose different forms of antinomianism in the subsequent decades. And all the magisterial Protestants opposed antinomianism, which in essence is the denial of the third use of the law. So to suggest that making a hermeneutical distinction leads to antinomianism is absurd, because the people who gave us the categories, third use of the law, and who identified antinomianism for what it is, are also the people who distinguished between law and gospel. And the 16th century, 17th century Reformed didn't argue about this. This is something on which they all agreed. So anybody who says that simply doesn't know what they're talking about and hasn't done the most rudimentary research.
I got a question here that asked, what is the third use of the law? Would you just...
Yeah, great question. Third use of the law says that the moral law, we're talking about the Ten Commandments, or as it came to expression, whether Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, or I would say even before the fall, when the Lord said that the day you eat thereof, you can eat from any tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but you can eat from any tree of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. That is the briefest expression of the law, because it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Of course, that's our Lord's summary of Matthew 22, 37 through 40. So that's the moral law. That's what we're talking about. That's permanent, doesn't go away, because it's grounded in the nature of God. And it's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, contra the antinomians, who say that the moral law in effect goes away, and then they have substitutes for it. So that we say there are three uses, and they get numbered differently. So I'm just going to use their proper names. The first use is or at least I think of the first use, and Heidelberg talks about the first use as the pedagogical use. And that's what Paul is referring to in Galatians 3, where the law teaches us the greatness of our sin and misery. And Paul teaches it in Romans and elsewhere, Romans 7, among other places. So the pedagogical use is where the law teaches us our need for a savior. The civil use, sometimes called the second use, sometimes it gets reversed. Sometimes the civil use is called the first use. The civil use is the use of the moral law to govern society. So how do we know that murder is wrong? Well, it's contrary to the moral law. It's baked into the nature of things. And it's also, Paul says, substantially identical to the natural law. And Paul makes reference to that pretty clearly in Romans 1 and 2. How do we know that, for example, same-sex attraction and behavior is sinful? Well, it's contrary to nature, Paul says, and the natural law. So the natural law, the moral law, they govern civil life, and we would say, at least I would say, as an American, ideologically and nationally, that we're thinking mainly about the second table, right? As Americans, I don't, at least as an American, speaking for myself, as an American, I don't want the civil magistrate enforcing the first table of the moral law. I don't want Governor Newsom deciding what religious orthodoxy is or isn't, and then punishing people who disagree with the state of California on religious orthodoxy. We're getting close enough to that as it is. But we do want the state enforcing the second table, right? No murder, no theft, that sort of thing. No lying in court, right? Those are all violations of the civil law. And the third use is the use of the law whereby it governs the Christian life. So I don't obey the law in order to be saved or in order to be justified, but as one who has been graciously, freely saved and justified and is being sanctified by grace alone through faith alone, I seek to obey the moral law as the norm of the Christian life. And that's just historic Christianity. It's biblical Christianity. That's why Paul turns to the moral law in the second half of most of his epistles, where he lays out salvation and then turns around and says, and now this is what's expected of you who have been redeemed by grace alone through faith alone. And so that's the third use. So we're not under the law as a covenant of works. We're not under the law in order to be saved or in order to be justified, but we are under the law as the norm of the Christian life. That's the third use of the law. And anybody who denies that is an antinomian. And that person doesn't understand either sin or grace, and nor does the nomist, the neo-nomian, says, well, no, you obey the law in order to be saved or in order to be justified. So, for example, those people say, well, you're initially justified by grace alone through faith alone, but you're finally justified by obedience or law keeping. Well, those people are neo-nomians. They don't understand sin. They don't understand grace. They don't understand faith. I mean, they don't really understand the essence of Christianity, frankly. So a pox on both the neo-nomians and the antinomians. And see how simple that is? I mean, if a numbskull like I can, if I can figure it out, and anybody can get that. That's not that difficult.
Would you say part of the loss of law gospel is because of a loss of the covenant of works? And then how does covenant of works, covenant of grace relate to law gospel?
Yeah, that's a great question. It, in Reform circles anyway, because obviously the evangelicals don't think in terms of covenant of works, covenant of grace. They don't typically have a covenant theology exactly. They may have one implicitly, but they don't have one explicitly. But in Reform circles, to the degree that people have denied the covenant of works, they've rejected it as speculative, unfounded. And that was pretty widely done. If you look through the first half of the 20th century, it's very difficult to find anybody defending the covenant of works. Whereas middle of the 17th century, covenant of works was considered absolutely basic. All Reformed people affirmed the covenant of works. Johannes Coxeus, one of the nice things about working from home is I have all my books here. So Johannes Coxeus wrote a covenant theology on, and it's based entirely around the covenant of works. All right, and so the whole thing is structured by the covenant of works. That's how basic the covenant of works became in the middle of the 17th century, and that's why it's in the Westminster Confession, and it's why it's not expressly articulated in the Belgic or the Heidelberg, because they were still working out the vocabulary. Although I think it's probably implied in Belgic Article 7, when it says commandment of life. I think that may be a reflection. Ursinus was articulating the covenant of works in 1561. Belgic was published in 1561. So that was the turning point historically for that. But we, as you say, we sort of lost it. There were no summaries of covenant theology until Mike Horton's introduction to covenant theology, whenever that was first published, sometime after 2000. That was the first summary of covenant theology that actually explicitly articulated a covenant of works in the English language for a very long time. We were, traditional covenant theology. You have a covenant of works before the fall, a covenant of grace after the fall, and behind them, the covenant of redemption between the Father and the Son. Those three covenants, that was basic, traditional, bog standard, as they say in England, covenant theology in the 17th century. And by the middle of the 20th century, 2/3 of that was gone. You couldn't find hardly anyone teaching that anywhere. That's a big part of the problem. And so as a corollary to that, if you ask Ursinus, again, as a good, representative Reformed theologian in the 16th century, what do you mean by the covenant of works? He would say, well, I mean the law. Right. And so relative to law and gospel, covenant of works is law, covenant of grace is gospel. And he says that explicitly. He has a large catechism, which you can read in the introduction to the Heidelberg Catechism. Where is that now? Oh, here it is. But yeah, I've got a bunch of books that look the same. So there's an introduction to the Heidelberg Catechism, and I will have in my commentary whenever that comes out, I'll have a section on this. But in the back of this volume is the first English edition of Ursinus's two catechisms. He did a smaller catechism and a larger catechism. And the larger he did first, the smaller he did second, and the smaller became the basis for the Heidelberg. But in his larger catechism, he's very explicit that the covenant of works is law, covenant of grace is gospel. And so that was just basic Reformed theology, and you find Reformed theologians saying that pretty much that way thereafter. But as you were suggesting, we lost track of that to some degree in the 19th century, although you could still find it in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, in the English-speaking world, we lost it, and then we started to recover it towards the end of the 20th century. I think people are, you say what you will about Meredith Kline, he helped us hang on to it. He was one of the guys. He was a stickler for the covenant of redemption and the covenant of works, as well as the unity of the covenant of grace.
Sure. Well, you're working on the Heidelberg Catechism, so that has a law gospel distinction. That you recommend that as a good resource to get started on that distinction?
Absolutely. You will never regret spending time with the Heidelberg Catechism. I learned the Catechism out of the old RCUS German Reformed revision from 1978. So this is when I reach for the Catechism. This is what I reach for. But my Federation of Churches has published for $4 a hard copy of prayers and liturgical forms, the ecumenical creeds, and the Heidelberg Catechism, called Forms and Prayers. And you can get that from Great Commission Publications. And they've revised, they have a revised English translation of the Heidelberg, and it's fine. I would have done a few things a little differently, but it's fine. And then I have the Catechism on the Heidelblog, heidelblog.net/ I don't know what it is. It might be Heidelberg-Catechism. If you look on the left side of the front page of the Heidelblog, you'll see the Heidelberg Catechism there. So so I have my own translation, and it's absolutely clear. From where do you know the greatness of your sin and misery? Out of the law of God, not out of the gospel, out of the law. That's the Catechism, and then it very clearly distinguishes the law between the law and the gospel. It's the gospel that whereby we are brought to new life and true faith by the work of the Holy Spirit, not the law. The law teaches us the greatness of our sin and misery, but it's through the gospel that we're granted new life and true faith. And then it's because of the gospel and in light of the gospel that God works obedience in us, sanctification, and then flowing out of that obedience to the law of God. Not just some of it, we say, all of it. So there's really, if you just get to know the Heidelberg, the three parts of the catechism are guilt, grace, and gratitude, law, gospel, and sanctification. It's really not difficult. Those are the three parts of the Christian life. And we just need to hang on to all three. No reason to lose any one of those.
Sure.
Yeah, that's really good and a lot to think about. Any other resources that you would recommend for somebody that was just beginning to kind of grasp some of these things with law and gospel? And
sure. So the one place to start is to go again. I'm sorry I keep pushing the Heidelberg, but that's why I do it. So I keep on the Heidelberg, go to heidelberg.net/resources, and then you just scroll down there or search, and there's a resource page on law and gospel. So there's all kinds of resources there, books, articles, quotations, chapters, so all kinds of things to look at. One book that is very, very good that lots of people have found helpful that I think is relatively easy to get is John Colquhoun on law and gospel, Colquhuon. Colquhoun. I can't do it properly. I'd have to get a new pop filter for my mic if I did it properly, because it's to do it properly, it's like Dutch or Hebrew. There's lots of in it. So, but John Colquhoun, law and gospel is I don't remember the exact title, but that'll get you close enough. That's a very fine piece of work. Lots of people have been helped by C.F.W. Walter's volume on distinguishing law and gospel. I think there is a lot of good stuff in there. There probably are some things I would say differently than Walter, but I know, and I have only read parts of it. That's the interesting thing. People say, "Oh, well, you're a Lutheran," and I say, "Well, I mean, in as much as all Reformed people are indebted to Luther, and we are deeply indebted to Luther, sure. So what? Calvin called Luther his father." I just did an article in part to respond to the way people talk about Luther, as if, that's some sort of epithet. So I did it for for Southern Seminary, their journal on Calvin and Luther. We've come to have this weird view of Luther and Lutherans that Calvin did not have. We distinguish where he didn't, and we don't distinguish where he did. Most of the people who are attacking me as Lutheran worship like Lutherans. They use the same principle as Luther on worship, or the Lutherans on worship. That is, they do whatever's not forbidden, and yeah, they think of themselves as Reformed. Anyway, so just reading good, I think, old-fashioned Reformed theology. Perkins is very good. Beza's little catechism, if you can get hold of that, the Christian faith he did it's actually a confession that he wrote for his dad. That's very edifying in this regard. So probably other resources as well, but that will get you started. And so I was going to say, I learned my distinction from Reformed people. I didn't learn it from Luther. I came to Luther helped me understand it more deeply, but it wasn't Reform. It wasn't Lutheran writers or Lutheran doctrines or documents, or even Luther himself who taught it to me. So for what that's worth, it's basic to Reformed theology. So you people who are saying that it's not Reformed, quit saying that. Because I've documented extensively that it's Reformed.
Dr. Clark, just thank you so much for joining us today, and we've taken quite enough of your time, and we really appreciate you being on our podcast and on our show here, and know that many people will benefit from it, like we have. So given me a lot to think about. So thank you.
Well, enjoy your freedoms there in South Dakota. Some of us envy you. The Black Hills are one of my favorite places. I was in Spearfish a couple of years ago, and I spent a marvelous week at the OPC summer camp in the Black Hills. I don't know when it was, maybe 1990 or so. And that was one of the best weeks of my life, because the RCUS sent me out there to sort of scope out this camp and see if this was a thing we could, cooperate with. We could go in with them. And I don't even know what they did, whether they did or didn't. But they sent me out there to scope it out, and there wasn't anything for me to do. The OPs didn't need to put me to work or anything. So I just sat on the front porch of this cabin next to a trout stream. I had a stack of books, sat in the sun, and it was just absolutely marvelous. And watching this poor guy try to catch trout for a week. I don't think he caught a thing. I think those trout were really smart. I think I heard one of them laughing at him, but I think he was enjoying himself. So what a beautiful place.
Yeah.
And the good news is it's not Iowa. So that's.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we enjoy South Dakota, and we've actually had some people move here from California. It is interesting how the pandemic is affecting people's decisions and where they go and where they move. But
well, yeah, I mean, I think ministerial education should be conducted in person, but if the state of California keeps us online, then I could do that anywhere. No,
right.
We'll see.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome to come to South Dakota. Just ask our governor.
Yeah, she's been advertising pretty aggressively on the airwaves in California. So yeah, at a certain point you may want to draw the line, but I think for all the refugee Californians, there needs to be a re-education camp where you just go for a couple of weeks saying, so first of all, we want to talk to you about this little thing. It's called a constitution. So this is a thing that Americans hold dear. This is how we've agreed to live together. And then they need to be desensitized. Look, this is what freedom looks like. Right? And yes, you can do that. That's what Californians do when they go east of California. They say to everybody else in the rest of the states, until you get to the East Coast, I guess, wait, you can do that? And everybody else in between the East Coast and the West Coast says, yes, actually, in America, you can do that.
Hey. Well, great. Thanks again for I really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, it's good to talk to you guys. God bless you.
Hang on for a minute, Dr. Clark.